Hi, I'm Megan Kuhn with Powerhouse Real Estate, and today we're going to talk about why a contract might cancel. Here are a few reasons as we go throughout the process of a real estate transaction, why the deal might fall through. Whether you're a buyer or a seller, this is important information. Number one is due diligence. This is a condition that the buyer has to complete their inspection, decide if it's really a home that they want, and do any other sorts of investigations, even outside of inspecting the home itself. They can look into the local schools, they can check the sex offenders list, anything like that that they're concerned about, they're able to check. If any of these things comes back and it is not okay with the buyer, then the buyer has the right to walk away from the deal as long as it's before their due diligence deadline. Honestly, during this due diligence period, the buyer could walk away for absolutely any reason and not be held liable to paying the seller any sort of compensation because they have that period in the contract written. Honestly, the buyer could walk away for any reason during this due diligence period because they gave themselves that opportunity to have the due diligence period in the contract. The second reason why we see contracts cancel are financing reasons. This is one that you've probably heard of, and it's kind of the doomsday thing that everybody talks about. Financing is tricky, and getting a loan for hundreds of thousands of dollars is pretty intricate. And there's a lot of hoops that the lenders have to jump through because of our 2008 recession. The lending laws have really tightened up. So regardless of how much upfront work was done, things can still fall through throughout the process when it comes to financing. So this is always something that can happen. The buyer usually will also have a financing deadline where if they cancel before that deadline due to financing reasons, then they don't lose any compensation either. However, if they do after the financing deadline, then their earnest money would go to the sellers. Another reason is the appraisal. This kind of piggybacks with financing because the appraisal is definitely part of your financing. And if the appraisal fails, then the financing fails, essentially. They go hand in hand. But specifically looking at appraisal, if the appraisal comes in low and the seller is unwilling to negotiate, then the buyer has the opportunity to walk away if they can't come up with the difference between the appraised value and the contract price. There are some cases as well when it comes to an FHA loan or a VA loan specifically, where the appraiser can require repairs on the property. So rather than just looking at the value of the home, they're also stating that the outdoor trim needs to be repainted or some of the electrical needs to be replaced because it's a fire hazard. And if those things come up on the appraisal report, then they have to be completed before the buyer is able to complete their loan. And so if the seller is unwilling to do the work, that's another reason the buyer would have to walk away because they're unable to get a loan on that property because of the appraisal. I mentioned a couple of times before when the earnest money would be refundable or not. As long as the buyer cancels on all of these terms before their specific deadlines, that earnest money or the deposit that you put down at the beginning of the contract is going to be returned to the buyer. However, if those deadlines pass and the buyer still chooses to cancel or has to cancel, it's released to the seller at that point. Unfortunately, our Utah laws give very little room for sellers to cancel. Once you sign the contract as a seller, you have absolutely no way to cancel that contract without compensating the buyer unless you essentially force the buyer to cancel instead. If the buyer cancels, then it's handled like I mentioned before. If the seller cancels for any reason at all, then they are required to release the earnest money back to the buyer and match the earnest money. So if the buyer put down $5,000 on the property and the seller chooses to cancel, they have to release that $5,000 back to the buyer and compensate them an additional $5,000 in damages because they chose to cancel the contract. So as a seller, make sure that you're taking every offer very seriously and don't sign that contract unless you're 100% committed to get it to closing. I hope you found this video helpful. If you have any questions about contract cancellations or the process of buying or selling a home, feel free to reach out to me, comment below. My name is Megan Kuhn with Powerhouse Real Estate.